These are some of the oldest swords discovered, and they're from Turkey and about 5,000 years old. And they were essentially used like miniature thrusting spears, just little spikes. No parrying, no chopping yet with swords. And what's really interesting about them is they're made with what's called arsenical bronze, which is, instead of the normal copper tin alloy, it was copper and arsenic, which sounds really bad, and it was. But it didn't add any poison damage to the weapon. They just increased blacksmith mortality.
Sword of Gougion! I'm gonna go ahead and say that I had to like triple check this looking it up that this was even a real thing because it sounds fake. It is completely real though, I assure you, and it's also fucking wild. This sword was discovered in 1966 by an architectural team doing a survey around an aqueduct for the Zhang River. While excavating, the team found a tomb that was underground and full of water. In this tomb, they found a casket. They open the casket and find human remains, i.e. an old-ass skeleton. Or what's left of it anyway. But next to that skeleton, they find a wooden sheath. A really nice wooden sheath, in fact, that had almost an airtight seal around the sword and was finished in a nice black lacquer. But because of this scabbard, this sword was completely untarnished. Just entirely. What you're looking at isn't the sword after it's been like restored and like made to look nice again. No, they pulled it out the sheath looking like this, bro. And it is in fact still sharp. One of the archaeologists cut himself on it. He touched the blade to see, like, to test how sharp it was, to see how dull it was. And it drew blood. Now it's time for the fun part. You see these inscriptions here? These inscriptions are an offshoot branch of the language that eventually went on to become Mandarin. But historians were able to read it. And the inscriptions say, and I quote, "Made for personal use for the king of Yue," which is the state that they found this in. After some contention, deliberation, and close examination, they determined that the sword belonged to King Goujian. Sorry about the pronunciation, by the way. Okay, so they found a super badass sword that had been put away for a long time and had been underwater in a tomb. Belonged to a king, specifically made for a king. They found it next to a king. The crazy part? King Goujian of the Yue Kingdom lived 2,500 years ago. He ruled from 496 BCE to 465 BCE. That's before, like, Alexander the Great. By, like, almost 2 centuries. Again, just let me reiterate. This sword has been sitting underground for 2,500 years and underwater for over 2,000 years. We pull it out, it is still brand new, shiny, and razor sharp. This thing is like a legendary quest item. This is not real.
Yes, I know it's called a shillelagh, but thank you, that gives me the perfect opportunity to talk about these great sticks. Which, yes, some places are famous for their swords, others their guns, but Ireland, now she's famous for her sticks. But don't let that fool you, the shillelagh was absolutely a deadly weapon. And in technical terms, its use has gone back centuries, but in reality has gone back for thousands of years. And the gangs of the 18th and 19th century that fought with them could use them to great effect. But my favorite little detail about them was that someone wanted to take this knobbed wooden stick and make it, a little bit heavier. So what they would do was put lead inside the head of it, which in turn would make it devastatingly effective when used against another person. So this thing wasn't just a stick, it was a sneaky stick. I loved this idea, but honestly more for the irony than anything else. This right here is a karambit, perhaps one of the most iconic and wicked looking knives that you possibly are aware of on the internet. You see all kinds of different multicolored ones that are on sale in gas stations and probably made famous on things like Counter-Strike Global Offensive. But the traditional ones are perhaps even more wicked looking. You see, the style of blade that you see right next to me, that is one that is more suited towards combat. But the original karambits looked something like this, with a severe L-shaped curved blade. And the reason for that severe of a blade was that their primary use was as an agricultural tool in Indonesia, where kind of like a scythe knife, it would allow someone to clear roots and also to cut plants easily. And because of that association with agriculture, this was viewed as a peasant's weapon in war. No true Indonesian warrior would wield a karambit. The kris, now that was a noble's weapon. Which honestly, these things were wicked in and of themselves. But don't let that agricultural association fool you. These could be absolutely terrifying weapons in the hand of a skilled user. easily able to tear your enemy's limbs apart.
Traditional knights' armor was way more flexible than you might have thought.
Yeah, that is one of the mind-blowing things in history. There's this historical misconception that people thought that armor just grew heavier and heavier and heavier until you literally couldn't move in it. And that really wasn't the case. A full suit of armor weighs approximately as much as a modern soldier's kit, that being between 70 to 80 pounds or so. And what they found was that a person in a suit of medieval armor actually moved quicker and more nimbly than a modern soldier does. And so you may wonder why. The key answer is weight distribution. You see, the majority of the weight for a modern soldier is typically carried on the chest and back, as they use strapping systems as well as backpacks in order to actually carry things, along with body armor to protect the chest. The weight of a medieval suit of armor, though, is fairly evenly distributed across the entire body, making it much easier to move in.
Here's a fun fact. In many parts of the late Middle Ages, it was considered manly to have an hourglass figure. If you ever get the chance to look at suits of armor from the 14th to the 16th century in museums, you'll notice that a lot of them have a very small waist. Now, this has an aesthetic purpose, but also a functional one. Tying a belt below your ribcage is one of the ways that a knight can distribute the weight of his upper body armor between his shoulders and his hips evenly. That way your shoulders aren't having to bear the entire weight of the armor. As the Middle Ages progress, we see this frequently used in armor design. Sooner or later, it becomes a manly trait to have a very small waist where the armor can rest on your hips. Now, this is not to say you don't have your fair share of beefy boys. Take the armor of Henry VIII, for example. Still, throughout the Middle Ages, we continually see manly figures depicted with this hourglass figure. Now, for fans of modern fantasy armor, this doesn't make the fantasy armor illegitimate. If anything, it adds a level of legitimacy to some modern fantasy armor design. Just as historical armor accented the masculine figure of the day, fantasy armor can be used to accent the masculine figure of our time.
Technically speaking, yes, a pick is significantly better at penetrating armor. But in comparison to an axe, it's a far more specialized weapon and not nearly as versatile. You see, axes were good against armor, but simultaneously they were an amazing weapon against shields and shield walls. Picks, on the other hand, concentrated all of their force into a singular point designed to penetrate armor. And so while a pick may not necessarily do much against a shield, against a heavily armored knight, a single blow to the chest or head could knock them out of commission. It's an interesting question. Why didn't more axes have spearheads? I mean, it makes more sense to have a weapon be more deadly, right? Well, that is if its purpose is actually a weapon. You see, in the majority of cases, axes were nothing more than tools. And while they could be used as weapons, their primary purpose was, again, a utility tool. But if a farmer was levied into war, then it was exceptionally easy if they couldn't get another weapon to just take their woodcutting axe. And so when you look at axes that look like this, such as the Iranian tabar, this is not a woodcutting axe. The entire purpose of its construction and the way that it's designed is specifically designed for battle. And so over time, an axe that was meant for battle would usually have additional features, such as a spear point or hammer side. So why wasn't armor made heavy enough to stop just any blow? I actually love this question, because it brings us right back into talking about the medieval arms race that was armor. You see, over many centuries, armor evolved slowly but drastically, starting from a time in which heavy armor was essentially just chainmail, going all the way up to plate mail and then beyond. And as technology and strategy evolved over time, so too did the armor, with things like the crossbow being highly effective against chainmail, leading to increased plate armor. But the majority of swords were generally terrible against plate, which led to the reemergence of more blunt weapons that could crush or pierce an opponent in the case of a pick. But then early guns such as the arquebus are introduced, and so that plate mail starts to become less effective, leading to the development of armor that is significantly stronger in smaller parts of the body in order to protect the vitals, such as the cuirass. But even this armor can only get so strong, and past a certain point it's just no longer cost effective, leading over time to a gradual reduction of armor until it's basically just gunmen. This has got to be one of the coolest weapons ever made because it is way ahead of its time. I am talking about the Kulthoff Repeater, a black powder repeating musket that was capable of firing at a rate of 30 to 60 shots per minute. And this thing was made back in the early 1600s. So when one typically thinks of a musket, they are thinking of a front-loading weapon. Something where you first place the powder, then the ball, and then you have to stuff it all down there using a ramrod. and this was a weapon that typically enabled a firing rate of approximately 3 to 6 shots per minute. The Kaltov, on the other hand, used an extremely sophisticated breech loading method, one in which kept a series of musket balls here in reserve, and a large reserve of black powder stored in the butt of the weapon. The lever mechanism would deploy a predetermined amount of black powder into the gun, and simultaneously load one of the musket balls, which gave a stupidly quick rate of fire. With a quick hand, this was something that could fire 10 times faster than any standard musket. Excellent question. Why did something that was as amazing as the Girondani air rifle actually become more common? Short answer, they were goddamn expensive and could easily break. I mean, you gotta think, it is amazing that in the 1700s, you had a gun that was capable of firing up to 20 times in less than 30 seconds. But even if it could fire that quickly, because it used compressed air located in the butt in order to fire, every time you actually fired the gun, the shots got weaker. Thus, while your first shot is going to go through an inch of pine at 125 yards, your last shot better have the barrel touching the enemy if you're hoping to do any kind of damage. And since this weapon was so insanely complex, that meant that each gun had to be made by an exceptionally skilled gunsmith, which not only drove up the cost in the first place of buying the weapon, but if anything broke, then it would have to go back to the skilled gunsmith because there was no way in hell a soldier could just repair this in the field. Thus, the weapon historically was only used by a few elite units. So flintlock revolvers were not just possible, they actually existed. And let me explain. This right here is the Collier flintlock revolver, which was a 5-shot revolver that was made back in 1818. And though you did manually have to spin the chamber, simultaneously it was still self-priming. And this and many more guns were made by a man by the name of Elijah Collier, who was an absolute genius of a gunsmith, but simultaneously was not really good at marketing or mass-producing his guns in the first place. And so only several hundred of these special guns were actually made and were the prized possessions of the officers that bought them. One of the major issues, of course, as to why they never caught on was the fact that they were all handmade and you couldn't really mass-produce them because of the specialized parts, which meant that they were rather expensive and time-consuming to make, so it just simply wasn't economical for a lot of people to buy them. Honestly, the story of the Colt 45 is one of my favorite of all time. So for those of you who don't know, this is the M1911 Colt, a beautiful weapon and a classic design for the American military. But the entire reason why this gun came into existence is because of the Philippine-American War and the Moro Rebellion, in which Tausug tribal warriors were running a guerrilla campaign against American forces. And the crazy thing about these Filipino warriors was that bullets just didn't seem to kill them. Or at least the bullets of the guns that the Americans were using at the time, which were .38 revolvers. You see, these men before going into battle would actually take drugs and other substances in order to inhibit their sense of pain, and then would go charging into battle wielding swords and spears that American gunmen just couldn't seem to bring down without emptying a full clip into the enemy. And thus John Browning designed the M1911 Colt, which in using .45 ACP ammunition had a lot more stopping power. And so instead of needing 5 or 6 shots, you only needed 1 or 2, cementing this weapon in history. The worst weapon ever made in history is the Apache revolver. And let me explain. Throughout history, there are any number of bad swords, guns, and other types of weapons. But the Apache is so bad because it tried to do everything, and because of that it failed. Commonly used by French gangs back in the 19th century, the Apache revolver tried to be 3 weapons at the same time. A revolver, a set of brass knuckles, and a knife. Which for the French street gangs that were using them back in the 1870s, these seemed like the perfect weapons for intimidation. But holy crap, they were trash. First off, you're going to notice that the gun here doesn't actually have a barrel. And so this, combined with underpowered rounds, basically meant that the thing was only lethal within like 10 feet. If you folded it up to use as a pair of brass knuckles, you were just going to damage the gun so that you wouldn't be able to use it. Oh, and since the knife was only about an inch long, this meant that even if you were stabbed with it, it typically wasn't lethal. You know, funnily enough, I have not covered the grease gun, which I really should have by now because this thing is amazing. Or at least it was amazing in how unamazing it actually was. You see, the grease gun was not a crazy gun by any means, but it did its job, it did it well, and it did it cheaply. And really, that's what the US was looking for in World War II. You see, the purpose of the grease gun was to replace the Thompson machine gun. And by replace, I mean as a standard issue submachine gun. But why would you replace this thing? It's so beautiful. Well, you see, the Thompson machine gun could fire bullets extremely fast. Too fast. Its rate of fire would essentially turn it into a kind of bullet hose that would waste ammunition extremely quickly. But the bigger issue was that it was very expensive to make. Even in its cheapest form, the Thompson cost about $45 in World War II. The grease gun, on the other hand, only about $15. And one of the key reasons for this low cost was because just about every part except for a few was stamped in the case of the grease gun. It was highly easy to repair in the field as you could simply cannibalize the parts of other guns. It was lighter, and because the gun had a slow rate of fire, not only did you waste less ammunition, but simultaneously it was easier to control. Yeah, the Japanese did have some trash guns. In fact, in World War II, their guns were arguably the most trash. At least generally speaking, there were a few pretty good ones. Like America downgraded the Thompson to the grease gun because it wanted it to be cheaper. Britain lost the majority of its arms at Dunkirk, but still made pretty good weapons. Like the Sten was cheap, but it did get better and they were able to import more guns. The Germans had some amazing weapons that only got worse towards the end of the war when they lacked the resources. But Japanese weapons like the Type 100, goddamn, that thing just sucked. Like America wanted to use the grease gun instead of the Thompson so that it burned through less ammunition with a slower fire rate. But it was still decent. The Type 100 only fired around 350 to 450 rounds per minute, and the rounds used were these weak 8mm Nanbu pistol rounds. Which, mind you, this is a story in and of itself because goddamn this gun is terrible. Its feeding mechanism was overly complex, which caused it to jam frequently in normal conditions, but in rough conditions like in the jungle, the thing could be useless.